About 20 years ago, I was living on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in northern Montana, a place where strange and supernatural occurrences were almost a regular part of life. Weird things happened there, things that defied logic or explanation. It was a community steeped in both culture and mystery. And on some nights, it felt like the very air carried the weight of ancient stories and restless spirits. One evening, we were having a party at my apartment with about 10 people gathered. As the night wore on and the alcohol dwindled, I volunteered to make a liquor run to a small bar just a block away. I didn't think anything of it, just a quick trip to grab some more booze to keep the party going. I walked into the bar, made my purchase, and as I was heading back out, I heard someone walk in behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then an awful, rancid smell hit me. It was a stench so foul it made my stomach churn. Imagine a mixture of sewer, spoiled diapers, and rotten food. It was almost unbearable. I found myself gagging, fighting the urge to vomit as I looked around to find the source of the odor. And there he was, Stenog, the school truant officer. I knew him, but something was terribly wrong. His appearance was worse than I could have imagined. He looked like he'd been through hell, like he hadn't taken care of himself in years, his clothes ragged and unkempt. But it wasn't just his appearance that struck me. It was his eyes. They were empty, devoid of any life, like a hollow shell staring right through me. A cold chill ran down my spine as I tried to pass him, holding my breath to avoid the stench. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, horribly wrong. As I walked past him, he let out a strange guttural noise, almost like a scream, something that made my hair stand on end. I hurried out of the bar, feeling the weight of that chilling moment settle over me. When I got back to the party, I tried to shake it off. I grabbed a beer, sat down, and told everyone about the weird encounter. But as I finished the story, the room grew unnervingly quiet. Someone laughed nervously, then asked me how much I'd been drinking and what drugs I was on. I was confused, but I shrugged it off. "What do you mean?" I replied. Then one of the others spoke up, their voice serious, almost too serious. "Stenog died 3 days ago." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. No, I couldn't be hearing this. There was no way. I had just seen him. I could still smell the stench, still feel the chill of his dead eyes. I knew what I had seen. The room was silent for a moment, and a couple of people even left the party, saying that I had creeped them out. Creeped them out? I was the one who was creeped out. I kept replaying the events in my mind, unsure of what to believe. Did I really see him? Was it some sort of hallucination? Was I just imagining things? Who would believe me? The more I thought about it, the more freaked out I became. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it. But deep down, I knew what I saw. It wasn't a trick of the mind or the result of too much alcohol. It was something real, something that didn't make sense in this world, but was undeniably true in some otherworldly way. After a lot of internal struggle, I gave up trying to make sense of it. I couldn't reconcile the reality of Stenog's death with what I had witnessed, but I had to accept it for my own peace of mind. I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I saw. I just had to accept that there are things in this world, things that go beyond understanding, that happen for reasons we may never grasp. To this day, I still can't shake the memory of that encounter. I can't forget the lifeless eyes, the horrible stench, and the eerie feeling that something beyond the natural world was in that bar with me. The chill in my bones never truly fades, and I still don't know how to reconcile it. I just know it's something I'll never forget. Many years ago, I had a job cleaning floors overnight on the graveyard shift after the stores closed. The cleaning service I worked for had contracts with various businesses, including big names like Kmart, True Value Hardware, and a few other retail spots. Usually, we worked in teams of 2 or 3, depending on the size of the store. For example, True Value was small, so it was just 2 guys assigned there. The owner would always joke about how creepy it was to be locked in a store alone overnight. It was an ongoing laugh, and everyone had a story or a joke to tell. But I never really took it seriously. Every time I reported for my shift, there were always other guys with me, so I didn't think much of it. That all changed one night when I showed up for my shift at Kmart. The other 2 guys had called out, so I was going to be stuck working alone. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was just a big empty store. How bad could it be? But as the clock ticked closer to 10 p.m. and the last of the Kmart employees filed out the door and the parking lot emptied, I suddenly realized what people meant by how scary it could be. The store felt huge, too big for just one person. And as the front doors clicked shut and locked behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. At first, I tried to shrug it off, focusing on the job. But then I started hearing things, strange little noises in the distance that sounded like whispers. I'd stop and listen, thinking maybe it was just the building settling, but sometimes I'd swear I heard a voice. Hey, or yo, faintly coming from somewhere nearby. I'd look around, but no one was there. It was unsettling, to say the least. Every little creak, every faint shuffle of sound seemed amplified in the stillness. It was as if the entire store had come to life, whispering in the dead of night. I started second-guessing everything. What was that? Who's there? I kept calling out, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but my voice felt small in the silence. The worst part was when I had to go into the dark warehouse to grab supplies. The lights were dim, and the air was thick with stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The silence was deafening, and then suddenly, I'd hear a noise from deep within the warehouse. My heart would race, and I'd have to force myself to go toward it. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the dark or what might be lurking in it. At one point around midnight, I was in the hardware section. I couldn't help it. I tucked a hammer in my back pocket for protection. My mind raced, thinking I was not just hearing things, but that there was someone actually in the store with me. By 2 a.m., I was so on edge that I walked over to Sporting Goods and grabbed a baseball bat, just in case. Imagine it, this massive, empty store, the size of a warehouse, with no one else around. The silence presses down on you, and all you can hear are the occasional creaks of the building and the noise of your own footsteps echoing through the aisles. You peek out the front windows and see no cars in the parking lot, just your own lonely vehicle. Every noise, every little bump or rustling sound makes your heart leap. I can honestly say I've never been so relieved to see the sun come up. As soon as I finished my shift, I couldn't wait to get out of there, to leave behind the heavy feeling that had settled over me in the darkness. I don't think I've ever been so happy to see daylight. And as for those jokes about being locked in a store alone overnight, I finally understood exactly what they meant. I worked the night shift at a rehab facility in a rough part of town. We have a large locked gate with a protected camera overhead and one of those doorbell cameras mounted on the post. Inside the office, the monitors for each camera are mounted on opposite walls, giving me a clear view of both whenever I'm at my desk. It was a typical shift, the quiet hum of the office, the occasional shuffle from a resident, and the ever-present sense of vigilance. I was hunched over paperwork when I noticed movement on the overhead camera. A man walked past the gate, paused for a moment, then slowly turned around and came back. He stopped directly in front of the gate and looked up at the camera. It wasn't unusual for folks to linger around the facility. We're in a neighborhood where people often wander, lost in their own world or looking for trouble. But something about this guy was different. His posture was rigid, his movements slow and deliberate, and his face, it was unnerving. His eyes were hollow, his expression void of emotion, as if he were contemplating something unspeakably grim. It wasn't the wild energy of someone on a stimulant or the lethargy of someone under the influence of an opioid. It was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. I watched him on the overhead monitor as he continued to stare, his face angled up toward the camera. After a few minutes, I decided to use the intercom. "Hey man, are you okay?" I asked, my voice steady but cautious. No response. He didn't even flinch. His gaze didn't waver. It was as though he hadn't heard me, or didn't care. We have a rule at the facility. If it's not actively hurt or trying to come through the fence, just let it be. Engaging with someone unnecessarily, especially in this area, can escalate a situation faster than you'd think, so I let it go. I went back to my paperwork but kept glancing at the monitor. The man stayed. Minutes turned into an hour. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring at the camera with that same dead-eyed expression. I began to feel the weight of his gaze, as though it was reaching through the screen. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, irrationally expecting to see him behind me. After the first hour, I got up to do my routine rounds. The facility was quiet, the usual late-night stillness punctuated only by the occasional cough or creak of a bed frame. I lingered longer than usual, hesitating to return to the office. When I finally did, I was greeted by an empty screen. The man was gone. Relief flooded through me for a moment, but then it was replaced by a deeper unease. Where had he gone? Why had he been standing there so long? I rewound the footage, watching his departure. He didn't walk away in the conventional sense. He simply stepped backward into the darkness, his face remaining locked on the camera until the shadows consumed him entirely. The night dragged on, each sound amplified by my heightened awareness. Every shadow outside the window seemed to shift and move. I kept checking the monitors, half expecting him to reappear, but the screens stayed empty. When morning finally came, I reviewed the footage again with fresh eyes. Maybe I'd missed something, an explanation, a clue. But there was nothing, just the man, his empty stare, and his quiet retreat into the night. The incident has stayed with me. In a job like mine, you learn to deal with all kinds of people and situations, but this was different. It wasn't just unsettling. It felt wrong, like I'd caught a glimpse of something I wasn't meant to see. And now, every time I look at the monitors, I half expect to see him again, staring, waiting, watching. I used to work nights at Home Depot, and for the most part, the job was pretty uneventful, stocking shelves, cleaning up, and organizing the bays. However, there was this one stretch where the store stayed open 24 hours for about a week. That's when things got a little strange. So most nights, there wasn't much foot traffic after midnight. Occasionally, we'd get a random customer or two who felt like home improvement was an emergency at odd hours. Like that one couple who came in at 1:30 a.m. looking for marble countertops. The woman was dressed to the nines like she was on her way to a gala or something. Or the young lady who strolled in just after midnight, decked out in jorts and a full karate gi, looking for a specific kind of toilet paper roll holder. And I mean specific. She knew the exact model she wanted, down to the SKU. But none of that prepared me for what happened in the insulation aisle. It was around 3 a.m., and I was working with another guy on the night crew. We were restocking insulation and tidying up the bays. You know, the usual grunt work, lifting the big rolls of R30, stacking them neatly, and making sure the aisle didn't look like a disaster zone. A bunch of the big rolls had toppled over in one of the bays, so I crouched down to start picking them up and sorting through the mess. That's when it happened. As I reached for one of the rolls, a hand shot out from the pile and grabbed my arm. I'll be honest, I'm not ashamed to admit that I screamed. Like full-on horror movie protagonist screamed. My coworker jumped back so fast he knocked over a display of duct tape. I must have yelled loud enough to wake the dead, because even my boss, who was halfway across the store, came running over to see what the hell was going on. When I finally managed to yank my arm free, I saw him, a man, buried in the insulation, his hand still outstretched like something from a zombie flick. It turns out that sometime earlier, before the night crew had even clocked in, a homeless guy had wandered into the store and decided that the insulation bay would make a great nest. He must have been there for hours, completely passed out, buried under the rolls like a hibernating bear. And let me tell you, he was in bad shape. The smell alone told us he'd been drinking heavily, and judging by his slurred words and inability to stand up straight, he was far gone into whatever stupor he'd worked himself into. We tried talking to him, but he was too incoherent to respond. Eventually, we had to call the police to remove him. Even they had a hard time getting him out. He kept mumbling something about how warm the insulation was and how he wasn't hurting anyone. After they finally got him out, the whole situation left me rattled. I kept thinking, what if I hadn't noticed him? What if he'd stayed hidden until the store reopened? From then on, I was a little more cautious whenever I worked around the insulation bay. At least for the rest of the week, the store stayed open 24 hours. It's funny now, looking back, but at the time, that hand reaching out of the insulation was nightmare fuel. Home Depot might not be the first place you'd think of for bizarre late-night encounters, but trust me, working nights there can be a wild ride. I used to work at a small hotel, and my manager once shared a chilling story about her experiences working the night shift. She was always calm under pressure, but the way she told this story, you could tell it had deeply unsettled her. It started late one night, just past midnight. The front desk phone rang, which wasn't unusual. Guests sometimes needed assistance at odd hours. When she answered, a man was on the line. His voice was calm, polite even, as he explained that he was staying at the hotel with his 8-year-old daughter, who was a competitive dancer. He said he needed some advice on what she should wear for an upcoming recital. At first, my manager thought nothing of it. She gave him some generic suggestions, maybe something comfortable, breathable, and appropriate for her performance. But then his tone shifted, becoming unsettlingly casual yet suggestive. "What about fishnet leggings?" he asked. "Do you think those are too sexy?" Alarm bells immediately went off in her mind, but she tried to keep her composure. She hoped it was some kind of misunderstanding. But the man didn't stop there. He started talking in graphic detail about how his daughter had been trying to seduce him, describing how much he enjoyed watching her dance in her cute outfits. By this point, my manager was horrified, but she didn't want to hang up. She needed to figure out who this man was and where he was calling from. While keeping him on the line, she started frantically searching the hotel's computer system to see if she could match his voice to a guest's name or room number. The man claimed to be calling from a specific room, but when she pulled up the records, that room was empty. No one had checked in there for days. She felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. Who was this man, and where was he calling from? Before she could press him further or call the police, he abruptly hung up. For weeks, the incident haunted her. She couldn't shake the man's voice or the horrific things he'd said. She reviewed the night's security footage, but there were no signs of anyone suspicious in the lobby or near the supposed empty room. It was as if the call had come from nowhere. A couple of months later, just as she was starting to move past the incident, the phone rang again. It was around 11 p.m., and when she picked up, a chillingly familiar voice greeted her. "Hi," the man said, sounding just as polite as before. "I was wondering if you could help me pick out an outfit for my daughter's next dance recital." Her blood ran cold, but this time she was ready. She responded calmly, "Let me guess, you want to know if she should wear fishnet leggings?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, without another word, the man hung up. That was the last time she heard from him, but the memory of those calls lingered. To this day, she wonders who he was, where he had been calling from, and most disturbingly, what his true intentions were. I used to work the night shift as a care aide in an old folks' home. The place was already unsettling enough. An old, converted hospital with long, dimly lit hallways and the kind of silence that feels too heavy, too oppressive. The kind of silence where you can hear every creak of the building settling and every whisper of the wind outside. For the most part, though, it was peaceful. Quiet nights, tending to the residents and keeping an eye on things. That was until the Grim Reaper showed up. It started late one autumn evening, just as the leaves were turning and the air had that crisp chill. I was making my rounds, checking on the residents, when one of my coworkers came rushing in, pale as a sheet. She had been in the break room, which had a window overlooking the courtyard, and she swore she saw someone out there. "He's dressed like the Grim Reaper," she said, her voice shaking. I thought she was joking. I even laughed, assuming it was just some weird shadow or her imagination playing tricks on her. But then another care aide came in, saying the same thing. She had been out on a smoke break and saw someone walking through the courtyard, a tall figure in a long black cloak with a hood, holding what looked like a scythe. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was some neighborhood prankster, maybe a kid messing around. Halloween wasn't far off, after all. But as the night wore on, it got weirder. Residents started buzzing their call lights, saying someone was knocking on their windows or doors. One of the residents, a sweet but very alert old lady who rarely even turned on her TV, swore she saw a shadowy figure standing outside her window, just staring at her. She was so shaken, we had to sit with her for the rest of the night to calm her down. I finally decided to look for myself. I peered out into the courtyard, and sure enough, there he was. A tall figure, dressed in a flowing black cloak, moving slowly and deliberately. His hood obscured his face, and in his hand he held what looked very much like a scythe. My heart started pounding as I watched him stop by one of the doors and knock, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I wanted to rush out there and confront him, but another part of me hesitated. What if this wasn't some prank? What if it was someone dangerous? I didn't want to risk putting myself or the residents in harm's way. Before I could make up my mind, he turned and started walking toward the far end of the courtyard. By the time I got outside, he was gone. No sign of him, no clue where he'd gone. The management was alerted, and they immediately called the police. They searched the area but found nothing, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. It was unnerving, to say the least. The figure came back a few nights later. This time, more of us saw him, and he seemed to linger longer. Once again, the police were called, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. This became a pattern. He would show up late at night, knock on doors or windows, and disappear before anyone could catch him. The residents were terrified, and honestly, so were we. The tension in the home was palpable, and even the most skeptical among us were on edge. After about a week of this, the facility finally hired a security guard. The first few nights with the guard on duty were quiet, and we started to hope it was over. But then, on the 4th night, the Grim Reaper came back. The guard chased him across the courtyard, but just like before, he vanished into the darkness. After that, he stopped coming. Whether it was because of the guard's presence or something else, we'll never know. But the whole ordeal left its mark on all of us. Even long after it was over, I couldn't walk through the courtyard at night without feeling a chill down my spine, half expecting to see that cloaked figure in the shadows. To this day, I have no idea who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it really was just some asshole pulling a sick prank, or maybe it was something else entirely. Either way, it's a story I'll never forget, and a reason I don't miss working night shifts. Many years ago, I worked as the overnight operator at a small regional radio station in the middle of nowhere, Australia. The station was isolated, perched in a tin shed smack in the middle of a paddock, surrounded by miles of nothing but farmland and wildlife. It was the kind of job where you had to make your own company, so I brought my dog along for those long, quiet nights. The job was straightforward. Keep the overnight playlist running, set up for the morning programs, do manual checks for the next day's broadcasts, and jump on air if anything went haywire. Most nights it was just me, the hum of old 50s and 60s tracks, my crossword puzzles, and the occasional curious sound from the paddock outside. That night started out no different. I'd kicked off my shoes, settled into my chair, and was halfway through a particularly tricky crossword when it happened. The roo shooters came through. For those unfamiliar, roo shooters are folks licensed to cull kangaroos, usually for population control or commercial harvesting. Their presence wasn't unusual out there, but they rarely came so close to the station. This time, they must have spooked the kangaroos in the paddock. I was focused on the crossword when a thunderous crash shattered the quiet. I jumped up, heart pounding, just in time to see the outline of a massive kangaroo, easily 6 feet tall, smashing through the office window. The world exploded into chaos. Glass rained down, the kangaroo thudded onto the floor, and there was blood everywhere, on the glass, the desks, the floor. My dog, loyal and protective but not the brightest, immediately sprang into action, barking like mad and charging at the roo. The kangaroo, understandably freaked out, started bounding around the office in a blind panic. Desks overturned, equipment crashed to the floor, and papers flew everywhere. It was complete carnage. In my half-asleep, barefoot state, I did the only thing I could think of. I chased my dog. My dog chased the kangaroo. And the kangaroo, well, the poor thing just wanted to get out of that tin shed. I managed to run to the studio bay doors and fling them open, yelling for my dog to back off. The kangaroo, now more frantic than ever, finally found the opening and bolted outside, my dog still on its heels. As I stood there, panting and watching them disappear into the paddock, I realized how eerily quiet it was again. Then it hit me. The kangaroo probably ran straight into the path of the roo shooters. I walked back into the office, surveying the aftermath. Glass crunched under my feet, and blood smeared the walls and desks. Equipment was knocked over, wires tangled, and papers were soaking in puddles of blood and glass. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. And then I remembered. I had to call my boss. I dialed his number, dreading the conversation. He picked up groggily, and I launched into an explanation that felt utterly absurd as I said it out loud. A kangaroo broke into the station, through the window. My dog chased it out. The office is a mess, blood everywhere. I think the roo shooters got it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he finally said, "You're cleaning this up before the morning shift, right?" That night, I cleaned up as best I could. By the time the morning crew arrived, there were still shards of glass I'd missed and a faint trace of chaos in the air, but at least the station was running. To this day, it remains one of the most surreal nights of my life. Who knew a quiet shift in the middle of nowhere could turn into such madness? All I wanted was to finish my crossword puzzle. Many years ago, I had a short-lived job that required me to clock in at the ungodly hour of 3:30 a.m. The work itself was mind-numbingly boring, but the commute was an adventure all on its own. The world feels completely different in those early hours. Eerily quiet, almost dreamlike, with a strange undercurrent of unpredictability. It was as though the regular rules of reality hadn't quite woken up yet. One morning, I experienced this peculiarity firsthand. I was exiting the freeway, minding my own business, when I noticed the off-ramp ahead looked shiny under the streetlights, almost like a mirror. I slowed down, confused, and then realized it was completely submerged. Water stretched across the entire ramp, reflecting the dim glow of the lights like a glassy pond. I didn't have time to stop, so I held my breath and drove through. Somehow, my little car didn't stall, even though the water was disturbingly high. When I made it to the other side, my heart was pounding. I thought, was anyone going to warn people about this? That wasn't even the weirdest thing that happened during those commutes. The most unsettling experience came one morning when I was driving through the quiet streets on the last leg of my route. The town was still shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the scattered street lamps and the faint glow of the horizon beginning to lighten. Everything was hushed, the kind of silence that feels thick and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Up ahead, I noticed something strange, a cluster of flashing blue and red lights flickering in the distance, but there was no sound. No sirens, no shouting, just absolute, unsettling silence. As I got closer, the reason became clear. A massive police operation was underway. Squad cars were parked haphazardly along the street, and the area was swarming with officers dressed in full tactical gear, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They weren't moving chaotically or shouting commands like you'd expect from a scene out of a TV drama. Instead, everything was eerily calm, the officers moving with quiet precision like shadows. Their silence made the whole thing 10 times more unsettling. It felt less like real life and more like I had stumbled onto a carefully orchestrated movie set. As I slowed down, unsure of what to do, one of the officers stepped forward. Without saying a word, he motioned for me to take a side street, his hand cutting through the air in a sharp, deliberate gesture. I nodded, mutely, and turned off, feeling like I'd just wandered into a forbidden zone. As I drove away, the blockade faded into the distance, but the weight of what I'd seen stayed with me. Later, I learned why they were there. Apparently, law enforcement often conducts raids on homes around 3 or 4 a.m. That's when they're most likely to catch everyone off guard, asleep and unable to react. Knowing this added a new layer to the strangeness of the moment. I had unknowingly been driving past someone's worst nightmare, unfolding quietly under the cover of darkness. That morning, I walked into work with my pulse still racing and an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. The juxtaposition of such a quiet, almost serene commute with the stark intensity of that scene was jarring. It reminded me just how much of the world operates in the shadows, while most of us are blissfully unaware. It's been years, but every time I find myself awake in the early morning hours, I think about that drive, about how the world transforms in the dark, about the things you see when no one else is around, and about how silence can sometimes be the loudest thing of all. I was once working late into the night on some scenic painting for a college theater production. The stage was quiet except for the occasional clatter of brushes and whispered instructions. Outside, it was pitch black, the kind of still, oppressive darkness that makes you hyper aware of every sound. The theater itself was eerily silent. No hum of distant voices, no footsteps in the hallways, just the faint echoes of our work. As we focused on our painting, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shape flitted past the open door leading to the lobby. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but it was gone before I could fully register what I'd seen. A moment later, it zipped past again. This time I caught a clearer look. It was a man. He had long, messy hair and wore striped pajamas, no socks, no shoes. The way he moved was bizarre, almost cartoonish, as if he were deliberately exaggerating each step. He lifted his knees high and tiptoed like a mischievous child sneaking into a forbidden room. And then there was his face. He was grinning, wide, toothy, and completely unsettling. We all froze, our brushes suspended mid-stroke, exchanging wide-eyed glances. One of the other painters whispered, "What the hell is he doing?" just as the figure passed the doorway again. Before we could react, the man entered the room. He walked right in, his movements still exaggerated and deliberate. He stopped in the middle of the stage, his bare feet silent against the polished wood. Then he just stood there, staring at us. The air was thick with tension, the kind that prickles at the back of your neck. He didn't say anything at first, just held his gaze, his eyes flitting between each of us. The theater was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, and none of us dared move. Then, in one fluid motion, he threw his arms out to his sides like a performer commanding the spotlight and proclaimed, "I am your savior, Jesus Christ!" The words echoed around the theater, but no one responded. We just stared at him, dumbfounded, unsure whether to laugh, scream, or run. It was like he was waiting for applause or some kind of reaction, but when it became clear he wasn't going to get one, his grin faltered. After a long, tense moment, he turned and walked out as dramatically as he had entered. As soon as he was gone, the spell broke. One of the painters scrambled to shut and lock the door, while another grabbed their phone to call security. We sat there, jittery and shaken, as we waited for someone to come check the building. When security finally arrived, they seemed more annoyed than alarmed. Apparently, the man was a patient at a nearby group home and had a habit of wandering off and pulling stunts like this. They assured us he was harmless, but it didn't make the experience any less unnerving. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory. Whenever I'm working alone in a theater at night, I can't help but glance toward the shadows, half expecting to see a grinning man in pajamas tiptoeing his way into the room. It was a dark and stormy night. The wind howled through the trees, the thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain fell in sheets. Despite the weather, a group of friends decided to go camping in the woods near an old abandoned house. They arrived at the campsite late in the evening, set up their tents, and gathered around the campfire. As they sat around the campfire, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. The wind seemed to whisper strange, unintelligible words, and the rain seemed to take on a life of its own, forming eerie shapes in the darkness. After a while, one of the friends, Jim, suggested they explore the old house. Despite protests from the others, he insisted it would be fun and not at all dangerous. Reluctantly, the others agreed to go along with him. As they approached the house, they noticed that the windows were boarded up and the door was hanging off its hinges. They entered the house cautiously, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. As they explored the dilapidated rooms, they heard strange noises coming from the basement. Jim, ever the adventurer, suggested they go down and investigate. The others reluctantly agreed, and they descended the stairs into the darkness. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the group found themselves in a large, open room filled with old furniture and cobwebs. They began to explore the room, but soon noticed that something was amiss. The air was chilly and the walls were damp, as if the room had been sealed off for years. Suddenly, they heard a noise behind them. They turned around to see a tall, shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was wearing a tattered cloak, and its face was hidden in the shadows. The group stood there, frozen in fear as the figure moved closer. It spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. "Welcome to my home. You will not be leaving." With that, it lunged at them, and the friends screamed as they tried to escape. The group managed to evade the creature and flee back up the stairs. But when they reached the top, they found that the door to the outside world was gone. They were trapped in the house with no way out. As the night wore on, the friends huddled together in a corner of the house, trying to come up with a plan. They heard strange noises coming from the basement and knew that the creature was still down there, waiting for them. They also noticed that the house seemed to be getting colder and darker by the minute. Their flashlights flickered and died one by one, plunging them into complete darkness. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint creak of floorboards and the distant echo of what sounded like whispers. "Maybe it's just the wind," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "It's not the wind," Mark whispered back. His eyes darted around the room, his hands gripping a broken piece of wood he had picked up from the floor. "We need to find a way out now." Jim, still trying to keep his bravado intact, said, "We just have to figure out what this thing wants. Maybe it won't hurt us if we..." Before he could finish, the shadowy figure appeared again, this time at the top of the stairs. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its voice boomed, "You dare to intrude on my domain? The price for your trespass is your very souls." The group panicked, scattering into different directions. Jim and Lisa darted into what appeared to be an old dining room, while Mark and Sarah ran down a narrow hallway lined with decrepit portraits. Each pair desperately searched for any clue or passage that might lead them out. In the dining room, Jim noticed a strange glowing symbol etched into the table. "Lisa, look! Maybe this is some sort of clue," he exclaimed. But as he touched the symbol, the room began to shift and twist, the walls morphing into grotesque faces that stared and grinned at them. Meanwhile, Mark and Sarah stumbled upon a dusty study filled with ancient books. Sarah frantically flipped through the pages of one, her fingers trembling as she read aloud. "The spirit bound to this house can only be appeased by what was taken from it, life itself." "What does that even mean?" Mark yelled. "It means we're screwed unless we figure this out," Sarah shouted back, her voice cracking with fear. The house began to groan, its walls shuddering as if alive. The shadowy figure appeared again, this time between the two groups, blocking their paths. "You cannot escape. Your lives are now mine to command." Desperate, Jim shouted, "Wait, what if we offer you something else? Something you want more than us?" The figure paused, tilting its head as if considering his words. Its voice was colder this time. "What could you possibly offer me, foolish mortals?" Jim glanced at the others, panic etched on his face. "What about the house? We'll make it known, restore it, bring others here. Surely that's worth more than just us." The figure laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. "A clever proposition, but it is not enough. One must stay. The others may leave." The friends looked at each other, horror dawning in their eyes. The room fell silent as the weight of the decision pressed upon them. Finally, Jim stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "I'll stay," he said. "Let them go." The figure's glowing eyes fixed on Jim. So be it. With a wave of its hand, a blinding light filled the room. When it faded, Lisa, Mark, and Sarah found themselves outside the house, rain still pouring, but the air strangely calm. They turned to look back, but the house was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. Jim was gone too. The remaining friends stood there, drenched and shaken, realizing that their lives would never be the same. Though they had escaped, they couldn't shake the feeling that the house, or whatever force inhabited it, was still watching, waiting for its next visitors.